I want to talk about the ideas in George Orwell's famous novel, 1984. 1984 is a remarkable book. It is, as Harold Bloom put it, a good, bad book. Why bad? Well, the characterization isn't great. The plot isn't entirely plausible or particularly complex. In fact, it's a little bit predictable. Nevertheless, it's an immensely powerful book, and there are a lot of important ideas in it. So I'm going to be talking about it today in three parts. First part has to do with truth and intellectual integrity. The second part, Orwell's ethics and political philosophy. And the last, we're going to step back into metaphysics, not the strong suit of Winston Smith, our main character, but we're going to think about the connection between the issues we've talked about and broader philosophical issues involving meaning, involving idealism and realism, involving the nature of reality that makes truth possible. So let's begin. George Orwell was born Eric Arthur Blair. George Orwell was a sort of pen name that he began using, and it stuck. It became popular. Well, he was born in India, actually, and then was educated in England at very exclusive schools, at St. Cyprian's, which he hated, and then at Eton. And afterwards, he did not pursue the kind of career path you might expect for someone of the British upper classes, educated at those kinds of schools. Instead, he had a remarkable series of jobs. He worked as a police officer in Burma at first. Then he became a high school teacher, a bookstore clerk, a propagandist during World War II, a literary editor, a war correspondent, a dishwasher in Paris, and a hop picker in the fields of Kent. So he did a wide variety of things. He fought in particular on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. He became deeply disillusioned. He saw communists gradually take over the Republican side while fascists took over the other Falangist side. And so the fight, which started out being between traditionalists and those who were democracy advocates in Spain, very quickly turned into a fight between communism and fascism. It was basically Hitler versus Stalin. And he wrote a book, Homage to Catalonia, describing his disillusionment with what had taken place in Spain. He never gave up his early socialism. However, he insisted on a democratic socialism, and he became firmly anti-communist. In 1944, during the Second World War, Orwell's house in London was bombed. It was utterly destroyed. Luckily, nobody was home, so no human beings were injured. But the manuscript for Animal Farm was in the house. It was the only manuscript he had, the only copy he had. So he went rushing back to the house and dug through the rubble to find the manuscript. Luckily, he managed to find it. A few years later, he died of tuberculosis in 1950. But in the months leading up to that, he published 1984. 1984 was originally entitled The Last Man in Europe. Let's talk about some of the philosophical themes in the book, and in particular, let's start with a series of topics involving truth and intellectual integrity. Much of the book has to do with themes about truth, about the nature of truth, and the very possibility of truth in a totalitarian society. So let's start. Philip Rieff has said, Orwell's problem is how to live honestly in a world that's no longer liberal, and his unique perspective on the politics and poverty of the world was gained from being very honestly involved in both. He talks a lot in the book about disinformation, about propaganda that distorts the nature of reality fundamentally, and it's embodied in the party's slogans. Namely, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The party distorts things fundamentally. Why? Well, it has the view that if one is to rule and to continue ruling, one must be able to dislocate the sense of reality. Now, the ideology of the party in 1984 is especially contradictory. It's really quite bizarre. It combines all sorts of elements that clash with one another. But I think Orwell's view is that any totalitarian system does the same thing. It may not be a requirement of all politics, but it is a requirement of politics where somebody wants constant and uninterrupted, unchallengeable power. So he says, for example, the official ideology abounds with contradictions, even when there's no practical reason for them. The party rejects and vilifies every principle for which the socialist movement originally stood, and it chooses to do this in the name of socialism. It displays utter contempt for the working class at the same time that it dresses party members in overalls, the uniform of the working class. It undermines the solidarity of the family, but it calls its leader Big Brother, relying on family ties for a source of affection for the leader. The four ministries are remarkable. They're entitled the Ministry of Peace, which is dedicated to war, the Ministry of Truth, dedicated to lies, the Ministry of Love, dedicated to torture, and the Ministry of Plenty, dedicated to starvation. Now, part of the reason that it's necessary for the party to distort things so badly is the nature of its specific ideology. Orwell says oceanic society rests ultimately on the belief that Big Brother is omnipotent and the party's infallible. But since in reality Big Brother is not omnipotent and the party is not infallible, there is a need for an unwearying moment-to-moment flexibility in the treatment of facts. One of the ironies that Orwell notes is that the intelligentsia ends up with much worse ideas than the average person. At one point he says, if there's any hope, it lies in the proles, the proletarians. Why? In part because they are not very affected by the ideology. But the ideology is one that fundamentally distorts reality. And so the smarter you are, in a sense, the higher your position in society, the more likely you are to have ideas that distort reality, that are, in a sense, crazy. So Orwell says, for example, in our society, those who have the best knowledge of what's happening are also those who are furthest from seeing the world as it is. In general, the greater the understanding, the greater the delusion. The more intelligent, the less sane. In another work, published just a few years before 1984, Notes on Nationalism, he said the same idea in a way that's become quoted very frequently and sometimes misquoted. One has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe things like that. No ordinary man could be such a fool. Well, that is part of the problem that he sees. The people who are leaders, who are part of the intelligentsia, who are smart people, but nevertheless educated in an ideology that ultimately makes no sense and does distort reality, end up having ideas that are the farthest from the truth. In part, that means the party has to deny people freedom, has to deny them freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of association, other freedoms that would allow them to compare ideas to reality. That has to be stopped. You can't point out the obvious. You can't say things that accord with common sense. You can't state even obvious truths. So Winston Smith at one point writes in his diary, freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4. If that is granted, all else follows. Of course, this later becomes a key issue when he is under interrogation. O'Brien begins demanding that he deny obvious truths. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? 4. And if the party says it is not 4 but 5, then how many? 4. Sometimes, Winston. Sometimes they're 5. Sometimes they're 3. Sometimes they're all of them at once. You must try harder. It is not easy to become sane. Of course, becoming sane in the party's dialect really means becoming insane, being willing to hold all sorts of crazy ideas, contradictory ideas, in your head at once, ideas that diverge sharply from reality. The party invents its own language, in part to keep you from thinking thoughts it does not want you to think, in part to force you into thinking the thoughts that it does want you to think. That language is called Newspeak. And so, what is it? Well, it's the official language of Oceania. It's been devised to meet the ideological needs of INGSOC, the party, which is really a shortening of English socialism. And INGSOC creates this language in order to basically limit the bounds of thought. Wittgenstein at one point says, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Well then, if we limit the language, we can limit your world. We can limit your ability to think about the world. The purpose of Newspeak, Orwell says, was not only to provide a medium of expression for the worldview and mental habits proper to the devotees of INGSOC, but to make all other modes of thought impossible. Newspeak is closely connected to another technique that members of the party have to learn, doublethink. What is doublethink? Well, it's holding contradictory ideas in your head at the same time and being able to switch between them at will. Doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. The party intellectual knows in which direction his memories must be altered. He therefore knows that he's playing tricks with reality, but by the exercise of doublethink, he also satisfies himself that reality is not violated. The essential act of the party is to use conscious deception while retaining the firmness of purpose that goes with complete honesty, to tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them, to forget any fact that's become inconvenient, and then, when it becomes necessary again, to draw it back from oblivion for just so long as it's needed, to deny the existence of objective reality, and all the while to take account of the reality which one denies. All this is indispensably necessary. In order to engage in doublethink, well, you have to not really be aware that you're using doublethink at all. So all of that has to become automatic. It can't be a conscious process. You've got to use doublethink and really be completely unaware and deny that you're using it. You've got to, in short, apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then once again to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. Well, of course, this means denying privacy altogether. The telescreens are there watching you, and the posters remind you Big Brother is watching you all the way throughout. It is a constant surveillance state. But in addition to that, since obvious truths have to be denied for the needs of the party, it means that people's memories also have to be tampered with. The party needs to control the past in order to fully control the present and the future, and it controls the past by controlling sources of information and also controlling people's memories. It sets up convenient memory holes in which you can put things that will simply disappear. Of course, Winston does that, assuming they just get consumed by the flames. And then it turns out O'Brien has been collecting a lot of these in the past and knows about them. So it's doubtful that they actually go to be consumed by flames directly. They are, in many cases at least, intercepted by agents of the party. I want to turn now to an important concept, the concept of self-respect. Because the party not only needs to interrupt memories and to get people to engage in doublethink and hold these contradictory ideas in their heads at once, distorting reality in the process, it also has to undermine people's sense of self-respect. It has to humiliate them. What, after all, is the world like that the party is trying to create? Well, O'Brien explains it. It's a world of fear and treachery and torment, a world of trampling and being trampled upon, a world which will grow not less but more merciless as it refines itself. Progress in our world would be progress toward more pain. The old civilizations claimed that they were founded on love or justice. Ours is founded upon hatred. In our world there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. Everything else we shall destroy. Everything. That means destroying self-respect. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. This idea of a totalitarian society needing to undermine self-respect is, I think, quite important. Here's how Theodore Dalrymple put it. In my study of communist societies, I came to the conclusion that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or convince, not to inform, but to humiliate, and therefore the less it corresponded to reality, the better. When people are forced to remain silent, when they're being told the most obvious lies, or even worse, when they're forced to repeat the lies themselves, they lose once and for all their sense of probity. To assent to obvious lies is in some small way to become evil oneself. One standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. A society of emasculated liars is easy to control.